Good morning, friends and brethren. Very good to see you this morning. Glad that you are here. I'm going to try to give you a report right now on some of the work in Africa that we've been involved in. As you know, this was the second trip to Africa this year. Normally that's not the case. I make one trip a year. I've been doing that for a number of years. But because we were not able to go for a couple of years because of the COVID restrictions, Tad and Steve, my travel partners, and I, we thought it would be a good idea if we could try to squeeze 2 trips in a piece this year. And back in January, that seemed like a really good idea. In September, I wasn't so sure. And in August, as we were making plans for the trip, and on this trip it was Steve and I, and we were both just kind of dying, bemoaning to each other every couple of days about, man, I'm not going to make it. I've got so much to do. I'm so behind. But somehow things came together and we made the trip, and some good things that happened there, I think. And I want to share some things with you. But to even answer the question that comes up from time to time, well, in fact, pretty often, is just why? I mean, why do you keep going back to Africa? And there are several reasons why, but I would begin with this. It's about the people. It's all about the people. And whether that is meeting brethren out in the bush, or preacher training classes, or preaching in someone's home, it is all about the people. It's the people. That's what keeps us going back time after time. Every time we go, it seems, there are just so many opportunities that are presented. Opportunities to teach, opportunities to encourage, and it's hard. I've told you it's hard. You see me when I come back, you know it's hard. And, we're wearied. But never am I wearied because of the people. Their thirst for the Bible, their thirst for knowledge, their thirst for drawing closer to God is what draws me back there time and again. It's the people. Preaching that loses sight of the people is not good preaching. And that doesn't matter if it's in Africa or any place else in the world or if it's in Taylor, South Carolina. Preaching that loses sight of the people cannot be good preaching. In Matthew chapter 9, you're familiar with the passage here of Jesus when he kind of looks out over the crowd. There's a multitude that's following him, and it seems to be growing. In every place Jesus goes, he continues to preach the coming of the kingdom. And in Matthew chapter 9, verse 35, it says, "And Jesus went about to all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion for them, because they were weary and scattered like sheep having no shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is truly plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray the Lord of harvest to send out laborers to the harvest.'" Jesus never lost sight of the people. That was his place. That was his purpose. What he came to do was to offer to be a sacrifice for us, to save the people. Jesus understood the people and he had compassion on each one. And we can never lose sight of the people. Joy and happiness is not measured by wealth or material goods. Sometimes I think we use those metrics. I'm just going to say, it's not good. Because joy and happiness, true contentment is not found in the things that we have. Because I have seen people who live in very difficult circumstances who are very happy in the Lord and who are happy to hear gospel preaching and are happy to know about the hope that is found in the Lord. The Apostle Paul knew something about contentment when he said, "I have learned in whatever state I am to be content," in Philippians chapter 4. But leading up to that, there was something else that was said. If we remember about the Apostle Paul, that he was one who had reason or purpose perhaps to be happy in the things that he had in life. And in life, he at the least had position and place and maybe some power and authority, being a leader among the Jews. But he said, "What things were gained to me, these I have counted loss for Christ." That what he found in Christ was a much greater value, and yet what I can tell is that his time in Christ was filled with some very difficult days. And as far as material possessions go, I don't know that he had any. And yet he found contentment and hope in Christ. In Africa, I find people time and again who are very happy in the Lord. And they find their joy in the Lord. Simple faith. And it is by such simple faith, it is abiding faith that keeps them and holds them close to the Lord. Our trip this year, always there has to be a purpose, there has to be a plan, there has to be reason. And encourage and teach preachers was a focal point of this trip, just like it was the last trip. We had 2 occasions where we had preacher training classes in Gwanda and then in Bulawayo. Our purpose was to visit with brethren both in the rural areas and in the city areas to try to encourage, to preach and to encourage them. And we had a purpose to look and to see what are some of the physical needs of the brethren there. We've been involved in sending food relief to brethren in different areas, and I wanted to go to some of the places that have been recipients of food relief that we have sent, just to see what's going on. We get reports from those brethren, but sometimes it's just good to be there and just to see what's going on. And so in part, some things we accomplished was preacher training classes in those 2 places with a total of 75 men that were there. We visited 13 different locations. We spent 4 days out in the bush, the rest of our time working in the cities, and had the opportunity to preach and to try to influence by the gospel hundreds of people, including visitors that came from the village when we were preaching in the different villages. You might recall that earlier in the year, Tad Corder and I, we went on a trip back in end of April, first part of May, to this area right here, Livingston, Zambia, and Victoria Falls, Zimbabwe, our focus being preacher training. There are 2 different preacher training classes, a little bit of preaching in the bush. Preacher training is what we were focused on. Then Steve Klein and Lowell Salee went over to this area back in July and spent 2 weeks working in that area. And then it was just Steve and I on this trip. As you can see, from the far south all the way up to this region here, we covered a lot of ground. It was a lot of miles. I don't like that part as much. But to get out in the bush and to go to some of the places I felt like we needed to visit, we had to have some windshield time. And that's what we had on this trip, for sure. And so, with that all being said, I want to say again, thank you for helping me to go. It has been the Taylor's Church that totally funded my travel expenses to go to these places and to do this work. And I've said it before, but I so much want you to understand that I never want this to be looked at as just my work, because it's not, because without you, I couldn't do what I'm doing. And it's a collective work. And I want us very much to view it that way. And it's not just the financial implications, which are substantial, but it's others who are helping and filling in when I'm not here. There's a gap that has to be filled. I'm afraid Ben kind of shoulders the biggest part of that, but others involved too, filling in classes and taking care of things when I'm gone. It's a collective work, and I want us to see it just that way. From the moment you step off the plane in Africa, it's like they say, you know you're not in Kansas anymore. I mean, everything about it is different. The air is different. It smells different. It looks different. Everything tastes different, including the sand. It's all different everywhere you go. And as soon as we got off the plane, we were on the road. We were driving 2 hours to Gwanda because that's where we were starting our work. And as you come into the city or the town of Gwanda, this is sort of what it looks like. I mean, it's the bigger city in the region, though it's not very big. And I don't think you'd really call it a city, just a town. It's a bus central kind of place. There are buses coming in and out of town, taking people different directions all day and all night. You know, there are street vendors along the side of the road everywhere you go. And, there's a supermarket there, the Zapalalala supermarket, which is nothing like Publix, I will say. But that would be the big grocery market, a supermarket in the area. 2 guys I want you to know about here. Big Boy Doobie on the left there. I've worked with Big Boy for about 15 years now. and a man just very dedicated in the work and dedicated to the Lord. And he really helped a lot in organizing our time in Rwanda and putting together the preacher training there. And then Pick Ngomwa is one of Big Boy's preacher boys, I say. It was about 7 or 8 years ago when we were in Rwanda one time. We went to Big Boy's house, and there were 4 high school or college boys living there with him. And young men who were members of the church or had been converted with Big Boy's work. And these were men that lived with him for some time. And Big Boy's had a lot of influence on them. All 4 of them are preaching. A couple of them have some other work that they do and support themselves. But ones like Pick have just really kind of, excelled and done so well. 3 or 4 years ago, I still had some questions with Pick. Was he really maturing the way he should? And I was a little concerned about that. But those concerns are gone after this trip and the time that we spent together. He has come along well and is doing just a really good work. He works with Big Boy some, but he preaches in a little place south of Rwanda called Kalenbon, which is where we went on the next day. Kalenbon. Got there early on Sunday morning, and there was a group of about 35 that were there. And we started, as Pick said, he says, I want you to teach the youth class. And I said, well, I'll be glad to sit in there, but I'd like to hear what you have to say first, because I really had no idea where to start with them, what was their knowledge level or anything like that. And of course, everything had to be translated. And so Pick started the class, and in part, I wanted to hear what Pick had to say too. And I was really impressed with the way he handled the class, and we're doing some translating, some in English, and just the way he went. I mean, Pick, let's understand, some would say he has a disability. I'm not sure he looks at it quite that way as much, but his arms are only this long. And he has 2 fingers on one side and just 1 finger on the other. And yet I rode in his car, and he drove us down to Kalenbon. Sits about this far away from the steering wheel. And some things are modified where he can drive. And he did a good job, though it was a little disconcerting at times, But what I was most impressed with was not his driving skills, but the way he dealt with the young people and the way he taught the class. And he have a Bible that he can hold, but it's a little hard for him to get to one place to another. So he just quotes a lot of passages. And he had no notes. And as you know, typically, I don't preach without notes. I'm just not good at that. But everything he had to say, one passage to the next, all pulled together perfectly, no notes to be seen. He was well prepared. And I was really impressed and kind of relieved, really. My last experience 4 years ago is I just wasn't sure if he was maturing. And I feel so much better about that now. And so I preached that morning. If you were in our class this morning, demon possession, this is where I started on that. This is where it started. This is where they said, need you to come and preach or talk about demon possession. Okay, we'll do that. And it was here at Kalenbon. And I got sunburned there. I was inside the church building, but there's no roof. And I didn't even think about it at the time, but when I'm in Africa, I'm taking some medicine for malaria, and it makes you susceptible to sunburn. I forgot about that, but I got reminded. And thankfully, it wasn't sunburn any worse than what I was. So not having a roof is a little bit of an issue. It's not really their greatest inconvenience. They don't have a toilet. And so people have to go out in the bush when there is such a call. And that was their greater need, I was made aware of when we were there. But Kalenbon, that's where this morning was. And Pick's little car that he took us in, it's a car that's made to hold 4. We had 8. There is no personal space, I'm telling you. No personal space in these circumstances. And this is life in Kalenbon. There's a number of houses and huts throughout the village that's there. But this is a bit of a community that is there. There is across the road a couple of miles. There's a mine over there where they mine certain kind of rock for concrete mix. And so it's kind of like we talk about old mill towns. This is a mine town, and it's just covered in dust that comes up from the mine over there. And this is the supermarket right here. This is where you'd buy your groceries. And here's the laundromat. There's some wash tubs there, and some of the ladies are out washing, and then you have the dryer set up right there. This is life in Kalenbon. On Monday, we started the first of the preacher training classes. This was in Gwanda. And Big Boy was able to rent a building for us to use for the days that we were there. And it was mainly men from rural areas that came. And there was at least 45 preachers. I thought I'd counted 49 one day. It got kind of confusing. But there was a number of men there. Several of them I knew. I've met before along the way, different places I've been. And so it was kind of a reunion in some ways, which was really exciting. And then some that I'd not met before. And so all of the teaching there and the question and answer period all had to be translated. It was all in Ndebele. And so you have to kind of work through all of that, but we're well accustomed to that at this point. Everybody stayed, all the preachers stayed at Pick's house or at Big Boy's house. Now, I've tried to get a picture of this in my mind because Big Boy has a couple of extra beds, and I can tell you this much, those full-size beds, we put 2 people in a full-size bed. Oh, I know there was more than that in those beds. And in fact, I'm sure there were bedrolls laid out all over the house where there were men staying. There's 45 men. And they stayed at Big Boy's and at Pick's, and so their sleeping accommodations, I'm sure, were not as nice as ours. We stayed at a little place in town. I had a bed all to myself, which was pretty nice. And this is at Big Boy's house, and this is lunchtime. The ladies had come and fixed some lunch, and that's Big Boy and his wife, Eurus, sitting there. Good servants. They just are absolutely servants in the kingdom. But this is something I liked every day. The men were always just so excited to be with each other and most of them knew each other, but hadn't seen each other in quite a while. I mean, they might only live an hour apart by road or 2 or 3 hours, but they don't have cars. And so they don't see each other often. And so every time someone new came in, it was like a reunion that took place again. And it was really neat. It was kind of exciting just to see that. And after lunch, having them just sit around and just talk and visit. I'm reminded what Peter has said, and I've said this before. In 2 Peter chapter 1, when he says, to those who have obtained like precious faith with us, by the righteousness of our God and Savior Jesus Christ, like precious faith. That there's something very special about that, something that we share one with another. It's what makes our relationship different. It's why when Christians get together, it is something very special, because we share that like precious faith. I know out in the world we can get beat up. We can have influences around us that are really hard or even hurtful to us if we're not careful. But when we are with those of like precious faith, there is something special that happens. And I see that with these guys every time we have an occasion like this. And I wish I could somehow bring that to you so you could see that and just hear the chatter. I have no idea what they were saying. It was all in Ndebele. They might have been saying, look at the funny white preacher. I don't know. But they were having just a great time, a jovial time, and they just enjoy being with each other. And those ties, remember those ties we collected? They love getting new ties. You would think we're giving them something just incredibly special. And we gave out those ties, and they're just excited. And they got to wear them right now. They got to start wearing their ties. They think that is just so great. Oh, I want to tell you about Ishmael. Here was something I wasn't expecting. In Gwanda, we're getting ready to start, and in that building we were in, it was kind of dark, a little bit hard to see, and all the faces I'm looking at are all black, and it's kind of dark in there. And about the third roll out, I kept looking at him, man, and finally it hit me, and I said, Ishmael, is that you? And he says, yes, it is me. And he says, it has been a very long time. Indeed, it has. It had been 12 years since I had seen Ishmael Nudlovo. And yet, I remembered him so well from our meeting 12 years ago. And we were able to talk about that a little bit later. 12 years have passed by. Ishmael is 75 years old, and I'm 12 years older than I was then. And so we have both put on a little bit of age since that time. And we talked a little bit about that, and I think he was excited to see me as I was to see him. And we just got to talk and visit for a little while, remembering back 12 years ago. And this was the picture that I had in my mind of him, because there were some things that happened 12 years ago that really, it made a mark on me, and it made me, and I've talked about Ishmael a number of times, and I never really thought I'd even see him. He lives in a very remote area. And we had been out in his area doing some preaching when I met him. We were at a village called Swingy, and we had gone out there for 3 days to do some preaching. And when we got there early in the morning, they had a small church building, but because there were Christians coming from a number of villages, they had put a yellow tarp. I don't know where they got this, but it made everybody look yellow underneath it. There was a big yellow tarp that they'd attached to the building. And we were going to start our classes promptly at 9 o'clock, which means I hope we start by 10 on African time, okay, because it never starts on time. And we were late getting there too, because we had come all the way from Bulawayo, and it was about a 4-hour drive, an hour and a half on the tar road and 2.5 on the dust road. I remember. And when we got there, people were milling around, and people come and greet and everything, excited that we were there. And I remember looking over in the tarp, I could see some chairs, and I saw somebody sitting underneath the tarp on the front row with their Bible opened. It was Ishmael. We'd never met before. But I remember that, and there's this picture in my mind about Ishmael sitting in there. He was ready. In fact, he was there at 9 o'clock because that's what time Bible teaching was supposed to start. We started around 10 when we got everybody kind of pulled together. We spent the night out there. We camped in 2 nights, as I recall, and preached 3 days. And Ishmael was there the whole time. And early the next morning when it had been announced, we are going to start early. We're going to start at 8 o'clock. We started on African time, about 8:30, as I recall. But I remember when I got up that morning out of the tent and I looked around, even before the appointed time, over in the tent, there was one person sitting on the front row reading his Bible. It was Ishmael. And the next morning was the same way. That was Ishmael. And I remembered he always sat right in the front and he took notes. What is interesting was that he didn't have a pad of paper. He had a sheet of paper, as I recall. And I've never seen as many words on a piece of paper written very small. And when you would take notes, when he ran out of room this way, he turned the paper this way, like that adds room. And he would write along the edges all the way around. And he took notes. And I bet he went home and studied them. That was Ishmael. And that's what I remember about him. And then when we were leaving, we were getting ready to go, and he was kind of standing there quietly to the side, and I thought he wanted to say something, and I wanted to say something more to him. And I went over there to him, and I was, Ishmael, tell me again, where did you come from? Where is your village? And he explained to me that he had to go over the Dolo Mountains over to the other side. And I said, how far is that? And he said, it's about 25K. I said, oh, that's like 15 miles, okay? I said, 25K. That's a very long way. And he says, oh, no, not too bad. I footed it all the way here. He walked. He footed it. And I said, and you were here at 9 a.m. And he says, it's okay. It's no problem. He said, it's no problem. If I leave my village at 5 a.m., I can foot it and be here at 9. Ishmael. Wow. I complained about our 4-hour car ride. All right? And Ishmael walked 15 miles so that he could come and be on time and sit on the front row and had his Bible opened. He came for teaching. There was no question and no doubt his purpose for being there. You getting my point? Something we can learn. You know, when brethren say, as I had one sister say to me one time, she wasn't coming on Sunday evenings anymore because, it's just getting too hard. It's so far. She had to drive 4 miles. Whew. That's pretty tough. Really? And on time. He walked 15 miles and he was on time. I'm not even going to start on that one, but you know where I'm at. Ishmael, my brother. It was just so good to see him again. Oh, something else I got to say quickly about Ishmael. As we were sitting talking later in the day, you know, he, in his village years ago, it was just it was kind of a small group where he was the only preacher that was there. And as we were talking about some, I said, how is the church in your village? And he says, we have grown. We've been growing. We have, I think he said 32 now, which in a village, that's a pretty good size, you know. But what was most impressive to me was when he says, I am not the only preacher. He says, now we have 3 other men who preach. And he says, it's taken a long time. And when he's talking about, it took a long time for them to be trained, to be ready, and to be able to preach. And what he said with that is when I am gone, when I am away, I know that there is faithful preaching that is going on in the village. And I just thought about that I just loved that so much. And he was somewhat relieved with that because as we talked about that, he was talking about when I'm away, when I'm in places like this, I know that there's good preaching that's happening back home. But he's also talking about, because we were just talking about age and all, that when I am gone, when I am no more, there's preaching, faithful preaching that takes place. It just made me think some more, again, just about the work of preaching. We've talked about this sometime. Sometimes we put so much stock on a preacher being able to stand in the pulpit and oratory excel. You know what? There's something to that. You know, Ben and I both pray that we can be effective in delivering God's word. There's something to that. But sometimes the sum total of a preacher's work is valued or summed up by his ability in the pulpit. There's value there, please understand. But that is not the sum total of the work of preaching. In fact, it's just a small portion. That there is so much else involved. Other studies and classes, encouragement for brethren. And teaching men to teach others. I'm not sure what's more important than that. There seems to be a point of emphasis that Paul had when he spoke to the young evangelist Timothy and said, and the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who are able to teach others also. Ishmael had done that well. He had fulfilled his work of ministry well. Ishmael, my brother, I just had to tell you about him. So after supper, we go back and we preach some more. The men wanted more preaching and we stayed. It was dark in that room before, but now it's really dark. Steve is speaking right now and he's holding his cell phone for extra light. I was doing the same thing. It got really tough. You know, I have one of these little lights on a tripod that I always carry. I forgot it this time. I'm glad I had that cell phone or else I couldn't see. It was so dark in there. But I made fun of Steve. Are you trying to be like Paul and preach till midnight? I need a little sleep here, you know. But it wasn't that late. Steve Klein has been one of my preaching partners for, I think, the last 11 trips we have gone together. I think a lot of Steve. He's a good man. And just glad to be able to spend this time with him. So after the classes, there were some who were going to try to get on a bus that would get them closer to home and then walk the rest of the way. These men right here were going back. They were going a long way. They were going back to Mbaringwa, which is about 4 hours out in the bush. And I look at these guys riding in the back of this bucky, and I know the roads that they're riding on. There's nothing comfortable about their ride coming or going home. And yet they were there, and they were willing to come for the classes. And it just makes me appreciate them all the more, their willingness to come. So after Gwanda, we went to the bush. We spent about 4 days out in the bush. And most of that off of these dust roads, as they would say, washboard roads. You know, sometimes brethren from Africa talk about some needs of repairs for their cars, their trucks. Usually it's suspension parts and tires. I understand why. I mean, the roads are just horrible. Just some of them just washboard. And these dust roads. And it was just it's been so extremely dry and so dusty. I've had this happen before, but it's been a long time. In my Bibles, my other Bible, I'm using this one. One reason why is there's no dust in it. I will forever be trying to get the dust and the dirt out of my Bibles. It is collected in them. And it's like we would, end of the day, your hair is just matted down, with the dust. And I'm not going to tell you what it does to your nose, but it's not kind. And the breathing, and just the environment that so many live in, and somewhat used to it, you have to say. And this one day, we drove for 4 hours on the dust roads. The only other traffic we had was 2 donkey carts. No other vehicles there, no other cars on the way, any trucks. And this has nothing to do with preaching. I just wanted you to see this tree, this baobab tree, that I think is just so interesting. It's a tree that looks like somebody has just pulled up out of the ground and turned upside down so the roots are sticking up. That's what it looks like, doesn't it? And yet this tree is huge. This tree right here is several hundred years old, if not 1,000 years old, just to give you an idea of the size. And this is not the biggest one I've seen. Just an interesting tree, this baobab. And so we go to the bush. We're not going to visit right now all the places we went, but I wanted you to see a couple right here, right off, of where some of the food relief that we've sent has gone to, like in Goma. That little yellow building there is where the church meets. But they constructed this other little area over here for when others from other villages came, like on this day where we preached here on this day. Steve preaching with the local preacher there who was translating for him. And looking out at those who were just sitting on the floor, which is most. There were just a few chairs, and the men, in descending order from oldest down, might have an opportunity to sit in a chair. But everybody else is on the floor, on the ground, for hours. And so when we get a little bit upset that our padded pews aren't padded enough, just kind of goes in one ear and out the other. Not a lot of sympathy, because this is how our brethren meet, every time they come together. It's just like that. We were going to leave pretty quickly after preaching a while because we had 3 places we were trying to go to, but the sisters had fixed some food for us. They figured we needed food for our travels, and I was happy that they fixed us some sudza, but that was a side. They fixed us rice. I was really excited. We have rice, and we had some meat. It was not chicken. I'm sure of that part. Now, whether it was beef or goat, kind of indiscernible, but we had meat when we were there. And then we moved on to Nkwale, another church that has received from us. When Paul was writing to the church at Rome concerning the needs of the brethren in Judea, he said, "For it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints who were in Jerusalem." And we have at times, from our contribution, supported the poor saints who are in Zimbabwe, in places like this in Nkwale. And then we moved on a little bit more to our 3rd appointment for the day at Guyu. Sandra, you remember Guyu, you've been there, and the little meeting place. And what was interesting to me about this is that we were a couple of hours behind on schedule by this point, being held up in some other places. And as we pulled up, we could hear the brethren singing, sitting inside, and Steve and I both preached. And then we found out later, we got there around 4 in the afternoon, and they had been there since 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, they knew we weren't coming to afternoon, but it was like they didn't want to miss our coming. And so I don't know if they had anything to eat during the day, but I said, "What have you been doing all day?" "We've been singing all day." They've been waiting all day and just singing, waiting for us to come and to be there. And you'll notice there's like no chairs for most to sit on here. And I just wanted to mention that here and in Columbine, there's some brethren that gave me some money just to use in whatever way seemed helpful. Well, we bought 10 chairs for Nguyu, and then some chairs for in Columbine too, is how I used some of that money that some of you gave me. And so some of these sisters will have something to sit on there. And then when we get ready to leave, they had walked there in the morning, but we're able to give some of them a ride on the way back. But here was what was interesting to me is they're so excited and just jovial about the fact that they're having a ride on the way back, but they're just jovial anyway. And these smiling faces, why do you go back? These smiling faces, and their joy and their happiness about so many things. They walked miles to be there. They sat for hours waiting for us.
I don't know if they've had anything to eat all day. They listened attentively. And then they wanted us to preach more, but darkness was coming, and we needed to get them home, and we needed to get back to town before it got dark, because it's not safe to drive at night. And so it's like, it's just all about the people. It's all about the people. That's what it's about. In another place, Chilimochi, I thought this was just kind of some neat pictures here of some of the young ladies that were serving, who always seem to be excited about being able to serve. In fact, sometimes I've seen where it's almost kind of turns into a pecking order again of some of the older young ladies being the ones who get to serve, and just their willingness to be able to do this. We're having a little tea and some bread. When we had got to Chilimochi, several had walked quite a ways, and some of the ladies there had made tea. And you remember this passage here in Romans chapter 12, when the Apostle Paul is talking and reminding us about the gifts that Christ has given each one, that we all have some abilities. We all have gifts given to us in some way and of some kind. And having gifts, he said, let us use them. And he mentions different things, but serving. Some translations say the gift of ministry, which in its root is the gift of service or serving. And what a wonderful gift. Sometimes we don't think about just being a servant as being a gift, but I am convinced that absolutely it is. And that we have some here at Taylor's who are incredible servants. Often doing things that no one else sees. But are sometimes here in and out doing things, just taking care of matters that no one else knows. Or sometimes you go to visit with somebody and you find out that I'm way behind the game here. Several others have already been servants. We have a lot of good servants here. Something not to be taken for granted. Some more preaching at Chilimochi. I like the picture on the right of these ladies as they're just intently listening to Steve as he is preaching. This being the last lesson. I think that was our fourth lesson of the day. And they're listening just as well now as when we'd started earlier in the day. And then some more road time. Out on the dust roads again. Going out to the area of Cholocho. And a couple of villages I wanted to share just real quick. We pulled up to this one and I thought, oh no, this is sunburn again. There's no roof. But they had a tarp. We were able to stand just underneath the tarp and stay in the shade with one of my trusted partners there, Mountbatten Brewer, translating for me. Brewer's kind of funny sometimes where we're going along, you have a cadence going back and forth, with your translating. And twice he said, Brother Joe, this is going to take a moment. And I don't know what all he said, but whatever it was I said wasn't getting it done. And it wasn't translating well. And we kind of lost our cadence there, but I'm sure what he said needed to be said, to get us done. I just mentioned real quick, there was no roof here. They didn't have the money to buy a thatch for their meeting place, but Steve had some money given to him by some brethren, just to use for whatever. And so he was able to give them $160 to buy the thatch. That's what they figured it would cost to buy the thatch, so they should have a roof here very soon. And the children in so many places. And this trip, it seemed like almost more than others. There were so many children. And it just reminded me of home so much. Because we have so many children here. What a blessing. What a blessing that is for us to have so many children around. Oh, and again, they fixed us something to eat. And it was something different. And this was like some pumpkin that was stewed up with ground nuts, as they say. It's like peanuts and some corn in it. And actually, it was quite nice, and it was far from suds. And so I was happy to have this little snack along the way. And then they put this other thing on my plate, which was, again, ground nuts and corn. And it was mixed up with, I really don't know what it was mixed up with. I didn't ask, and it was okay. And it tasted pretty good when I mixed it with the pumpkin stuff. And so it was okay. But the brethren, when they have anything to share, they just really want to share that with you. And sometimes you need to just take some time to do that. Preaching in another village inside of of a hut that was there. And again, brethren that had something to share. They had ground nuts, peanuts, we'd say. And they quickly went and they wanted to roast some for us. And I like peanuts, and so that was great. But they had this, made some into like a stew. They cooked peanuts into like a stew. It was quite nice. Have to try that sometime. Steve caught this picture of me with Brewer. I need to tell you something about Brewer. I just really like Brewer. Did you meet Brewer? Yeah. He is one of my most trusted co-workers there. We're about the same age. I think he's a couple years older than me. And this was the first time in several trips that we just really got to work together for a while. And I enjoyed that so much. He's mature. He is a good student. He's a good teacher. He's a good translator. He's a sound mind that other brethren there go to for counsel and advice. And I forget exactly what. No, I do know what we're talking. I was going to say I don't remember what we're talking about. I do remember what we're talking about. And I wanted to tell you about this. In the Indabelli way, they're not an assertive people, and usually, questions are not asked very directly if they're needing something or wanting something for you. And earlier in the day, he had said something about as we were driving along. He had said, there are these preachers out here in Cholocho and Lupani. They've never come to any of our classes. And he says, it's just too difficult to do. It would be good someday if there was a class for these preachers. And that was all that was said. And then we were sitting in the office in the back of the truck. And Joe, the preachers out here that you've met, none of them have come to any of our classes. They would benefit coming. And that's all they said. And then it was the next day when we were leaving, he said, Joe, he says, maybe someday you and Steve could come and do classes for the preachers in Cholocho. They need to hear these classes. And that's kind of the way the Indabelli are, not assertive in any way. And others wouldn't have said that much, but I take it because Brewer and I have some relationship. We've worked together at different times. That he would be bold enough to say, would you come back and do some classes for these preachers out here? And so, just interesting the way some of those things are. How many can you get in the back of a small bucky? 10. 10, and there were 6 inside. And these were brethren that we met as we were going we were going way out in the bush, and some brethren that were walking. I'm not sure if they would have got to where we were going by the time we finished preaching. They had a long way to go, but they were on the way, and we gave them a ride out to this place here, where we were preaching underneath this shelter right here. That was when it was starting to really get hot out there. I remember that, and an overflow crowd. Real quick, Brewer and his son-in-law, Solomon, whom I've worked with a lot and I hold in high regard. I have said sometime that it's like, I don't know of any father-in-law, son-in-law preaching teams besides Ben and I. And it finally hit me. I do know one. And that's Brewer and Solomon. And they work in some different places in the bush, but in town they work with the same church, the same congregation. But that's the only father-in-law, son-in-law team that I know besides, Ben and I. And but 2 men that I hold in just very high regard. And we're going to just kind of finish this up right here. Just some preaching under the mahogany tree. Our last 2 days were spent in preacher training with these men right here in Bulawayo. And one of the most encouraging things at the end, when Professor Mashoko stood up and said, brothers, he said, who is ready to teach preachers when Brother Steve and Brother Joe can no longer come? And this has been something we've been working on for some time, trying to develop men in such a way, and some are there, some are doing training with other preachers. But that needs to be more. There needs to be more of that. And now they're starting to see and understand that. And as I've said to some of them, there may come a day, maybe it's my grandchildren or great-grandchildren that will someday sit at the feet of your great-grandson who comes to America to try to save us from the mess we are in spiritually. You just don't know. You just don't know. when we were in one of the villages, we'll close with this. You know, our purpose really wasn't going out, preaching salvation type lessons. We were trying to encourage the brethren and teaching preachers. But one of the villages, when we got done preaching, there was an invitation that was extended in one of the lessons Steve and I were preaching, I forget. And there were 6 young people that decided that day to become Christians. And there's a local preacher there who was really surprised. Now, he'd been doing classes with these young people for some time, and he told us later, he says, I thought they were coming close to obeying. He says, but I was not expecting today. We weren't either, but it sure was great. It was just so exciting. There was 6 of these young people who were baptized on this day. And also kind of a surprise, when we went to baptize them, I was asked to say a few things. That's never happened. Always the local preachers take care of that. And I'm not sure why. They turned to me and they said, would you say some words before the baptism? Which I was happy to do, but that was just interesting to me. And so we saw that day, we watched 6 who confessed Christ and who put on Christ in baptism, these who had become baptized believers. And when these instances take place like this, I'm reminded over and over again that it's the same gospel. That it's the same gospel that we preach today. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We're reading the same book. We're preaching the same gospel. Salvation is found in the same way through Jesus Christ. It's our sins being washed away by his blood. And the need of that never being something that can be overemphasized. And even today, knowing that there may very well be someone who needs to put on Christ in baptism, who needs to become a child of God. Why would you wait? And why would you delay? But even today, become a child of God, your sins being washed away. If you need to respond to the gospel of Christ in any way, we hope you'll do so even today, right now, as we stand and sing.